The storm outside howled like a symphony of chaos, shaking the windows of the dimly lit art studio. In the corner of the room sat an elder artist, a man with silvery hair that seemed to shimmer like moonlight and hands stained with decades of vibrant paint. His eyes held the wisdom of years, though they sparkled with the mischievous curiosity of a child. He looked at the young man seated across from him, a wide eyed, nervous apprentice, clutching a blank canvas as if it were a shield. I can't do it, the apprentice muttered, his voice barely audible over the storm. Nonsense, the elder painter said, his voice as rich and textured as the paintings that surrounded them. He leaned forward, brushing his fingertips along the edge of a well worn paintbrush. You know, there was a time I felt the same, fearful, clumsy, ready to quit. But it was in my greatest mistake that I found my greatest masterpiece. The apprentice's gaze shifted. Your greatest mistake? You mean that painting? He gestured to a massive framed canvas behind the painter, a masterpiece of swirling colors and raw emotion that seemed almost alive. It was the painting that had made the elder a legend. That's the one, the elder said, smiling faintly, and it began on a night just like this. The elder painter's voice carried the apprentice back in time, to a studio much like the one they now sat in. Years ago, the painter had been a struggling artist, barely making enough to keep the lights on. His reputation was decent, but his heart wasn't in his work. He painted what people expected, not what he felt. Then came a commission that would change everything. A wealthy client, a cold, sharp eyed businessman, had stormed into his studio one evening, demanding a portrait of his late wife. The instructions were exacting, the tone arrogant. The man didn't care about art. He wanted perfection, a flawless replication of his wife's photograph. The painter had reluctantly agreed, his stomach sinking as the man handed over an envelope of cash. Deliver it in 3 days, the businessman barked, slamming the door behind him. For 3 nights, the painter toiled over the canvas, pouring his skill into every brushstroke. Yet something was missing. The woman's face in the painting was flawless, but lifeless. The more he worked, the more frustrated he became. On the final night, with the deadline looming, disaster struck. Exhausted and distracted, the painter reached for his coffee, only to knock it over, right onto the canvas. The dark liquid spilled across the woman's pristine face, turning her delicate features into a smudged, unrecognizable mess. Panic set in. He grabbed a cloth, trying to wipe the mess away, but the paint was still wet. Instead of fixing it, he smeared the coffee into the colors, creating a chaotic swirl of browns and blacks. In his frustration, he hurled the cloth across the room and slammed his fists onto the table. The painting was ruined. The client would never forgive him. But as his anger subsided, he looked back at the canvas and froze. The smudges and streaks had created something unexpected. The woman's face, though distorted, now seemed to radiate emotion, sadness, longing, love. The chaos of the accident had brought her to life in a way no calculated brushstroke ever could. The painter stood there for hours, staring at the canvas. Should he start over? Could he? The deadline was mere hours away, and he was too drained to replicate the original portrait. As the storm outside began to wane, he made a decision. He would present the painting as it was, mistakes and all. If the client rejected it, so be it. But he couldn't deny the power of what he had accidentally created. The next morning, the businessman arrived, his expression as cold as ever. When he saw the painting, his face twisted into a snarl. "What is this?" he demanded. The painter braced himself for the worst, but then something remarkable happened. The businessman's anger gave way to silence. His eyes softened as he stepped closer to the canvas, his hand trembling slightly. "She looks alive," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's as if she's looking at me, just as she used to." The painter said nothing, watching as the businessman sank into a chair, tears streaming down his face. The elder painter paused, his eyes glinting with the memory. "That painting was the beginning of everything," he told the apprentice. "It taught me that perfection is overrated. True art comes from embracing the unexpected, the mistakes, the chaos. That's where the magic is." The apprentice stared at the elder, then at the blank canvas in his lap. Slowly, he picked up his brush, dipping it into a pool of vibrant paint. "Don't be afraid to make a mess," the elder said, leaning back with a smile. "Sometimes that's where the masterpiece is hiding." And as the storm outside raged on, the apprentice began to paint, his strokes hesitant at first, then bold and confident. Somewhere in the chaos of color and motion, he felt the magic the elder had spoken of, the magic of turning mistakes into masterpieces.